She sent me a selfie with another guy, captioned, upgraded. I stared at it for a second, felt that sting in my chest, then smiled. I didn't reply, didn't block her, I just sent her something better. A photo of me in the same place we had our first date, sitting across from someone who actually respects loyalty. I didn't plan on checking my phone that night. I was sitting by the window, half listening to the city hum beneath me, that low, distant sound of traffic mixed with laughter from people on the street. My apartment overlooked the intersection where the late-night food trucks parked, and the air carried this faint smell of grease, rain, and something burnt. It was a kind of loneliness I'd grown used to, familiar, dull, predictable. Pause for a second. Like, share, and subscribe so you can join us for the full adventure. Then the notification lit up my screen. Her name. It's funny how a name can still hit like a memory you didn't ask for. For a second, I almost didn't open it, but curiosity, or maybe masochism, won out. It was a photo, a selfie. She was smiling, hair falling perfectly over her shoulder. But that wasn't what stopped my breath. It was the guy beside her, hand resting casually at the small of her back. Her caption read, "Upgraded." For a moment, I just stared. The city noise outside faded, and all that I could hear was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own breathing. My first instinct was to laugh, because it was so on brand for her. Dramatic, cutting, designed to wound. Then came the sting. That slow burn in the chest that starts as disbelief and turns into a physical ache. But it didn't last. I don't know why. Maybe I'd already seen it coming, or maybe I'd finally hit that point where heartbreak stops being pain and just becomes data. Information, something you file away. So I smiled, really smiled, and then I took a deep breath and decided not to reply. Not a word. No reaction, no block, no drama. I just opened my photo gallery and scrolled until I found something better. A place she'd know instantly. The cafe where we had our first date. It hadn't changed much. The next day I walked there after work, the sky heavy with late evening light. The smell of roasted coffee hit me as soon as I stepped in. Warm, comforting, nostalgic. The barista behind the counter was new, but everything else was the same. The hanging Edison bulbs, the chipped wooden tables, the faint sound of indie music coming from a speaker hidden somewhere behind the espresso machine. I chose our table, the one near the window, where she used to play with her hair and laugh between sips of cappuccino, pretending to listen to my stories. Back then, I thought it was the start of something perfect. Now, it felt like standing in the ghost of my own optimism. I took out my phone, snapped a photo, framed it just right, the same spot, the same background, except this time I wasn't alone. Across from me sat Emily. She wasn't anyone new, not really. We'd been co-workers once, quiet friends who shared office jokes and long silences that didn't feel uncomfortable. She had that calm presence, the kind that doesn't need to fill space with noise. When she smiled for the picture, it wasn't performative, it was real. I sent the photo, just that, no caption, and then I set my phone face down and looked at Emily. She raised an eyebrow. Was that for her? I nodded. Emily didn't say anything for a while, then she smiled softly. Good. The days that followed were quiet. Too quiet. I thought she'd reply, lash out, call me petty or childish. But nothing came. That silence, though, it had weight. Because silence from someone like her wasn't peace. It was planning. And I knew her patterns, the delayed reactions, the need for control. We'd been together long enough for me to know that she never truly let go. She just waited for the right moment to make you think she had. But I wasn't the same person anymore. So I started to let my life move again. Work felt lighter somehow. Emily and I began getting coffee after hours, talking about everything that had gone wrong, not just with relationships, but with ourselves. She'd been through her own mess, a fiancé who walked out months before their wedding. We were both recovering from different versions of betrayal, and somehow that made the air between us easier to breathe. One night, as we were walking down Main Street, the rain started, soft at first, then heavier. We ducked under the awning of a bookstore, laughing as the downpour turned the street into a mirror of neon reflections. Emily looked up at me through the rain and said quietly, "You don't miss her, do you?" I hesitated. I missed the idea of her, the version of her I made up in my head. She nodded. Yeah, we all do that. There was a pause, that kind of silence that sits between two people who know there's something unspoken. Then she said, almost whispering, "Sometimes I think heartbreak doesn't break you. It just edits you." I didn't reply, but her words stayed with me long after we said goodnight. It wasn't until a week later that the first message came. From her. No text, just a heart reaction on the photo I'd sent. I almost laughed. It was such a small gesture, but so loaded. Her way of saying, "I saw you. I know what you're doing, and I'm still here." I ignored it, but that night I couldn't shake this strange unease, like a thread pulling at the edge of something I hadn't finished unraveling. Around midnight, I got another message. This time, words. "You look happy. She's cute." I read it twice, then I typed, "Thanks," and stopped there. She replied almost instantly. "Do you really think she'll stay? They never do." That was her, the same mixture of charm and poison, wrapped up in a casual text. But instead of anger, I felt pity. I didn't reply. The next morning, Emily noticed. She saw the look on my face when I checked my phone, the way I exhaled through my nose before slipping it back into my pocket. "She texted, didn't she?" I nodded. "You going to answer?" "No." Emily studied me for a long moment. "You should delete her number." "I can't," I said. "Not yet." She didn't push, just nodded and changed the subject. But she was right. Because that number, that line still open between us, was like a wound I refused to let heal. And somewhere deep down, I think she knew that too. A few nights later, I found myself walking back to that cafe again. The city felt colder than usual, and the wind carried that smell of coming rain. I sat at our table, alone this time, and watched the reflection of lights in the window. That's when I saw her. Outside, across the street. She wasn't alone. Same guy from the photo. They were laughing, walking close, her hand brushing against his arm, the way she used to do with me. But when she turned her head and saw me through the window, she froze for half a second. Then she smiled, a cold, knowing smile, the kind that said, "You still care, don't you?" But I didn't look away. I just raised my cup slightly, a silent toast, and smiled back. Her expression faltered. For the first time, I saw something in her eyes I hadn't expected. Doubt. That moment changed something between us, though I didn't realize it right away, because what followed wasn't anger or confrontation, but something quieter, subtler. Messages started again. Little things. "Hey, remember this song?" Or "Saw your friend at the gallery." Always casual, always just enough to test the water. I ignored most of them, but part of me read between the lines. There was a tension there, the kind that builds not from love, but from losing control. And for someone like her, losing control was the one thing she couldn't stand. That's when things started getting strange. Emails from old mutual friends I hadn't spoken to in months, a rumor that I'd cheated, another that I'd been fired. All small, ridiculous lies, but too specific not to have come from somewhere. At first, I brushed it off. People talk, exes gossip. But when my manager pulled me into his office one morning saying he'd received an anonymous email accusing me of harassment, the world tilted a little. The email was baseless, no proof, no details, but it was enough to raise eyebrows. Enough to make me realize this wasn't random. It was her. The days after the email were a strange haze. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't sleep at night. Every time my phone buzzed, I flinched. Every glance over my shoulder on the street felt like she might be there, watching, measuring my reaction. The city around me, normally a comforting blur of lights, sounds, and movement, suddenly felt like a stage designed to trap me in some cruel drama I had unknowingly auditioned for. Emily noticed. She always noticed. "You're different," she said one evening as we walked through the old art district, cobblestones wet from a fresh rain, neon reflections spilling across the puddles. "I can see it. You're tense, waiting for something. Who's doing this?" I wanted to say her name. I wanted to scream it across the wet streets, let the air swallow it, let her hear it. But I didn't. I shook my head. "Someone from my past," I said finally, the words hollow, almost a lie, even to myself. Emily frowned. "Past people don't get to manipulate the present unless you let them. You can't control what she does, only how you respond." Her calmness was infuriating, not because it was wrong, but because it was exactly what I needed to hear, and I hated that she was right. That night, I went back to the apartment earlier than usual. The city was quiet, soaked in the sound of rain against the window panes. I sat on the couch, the email open on my laptop, and for the first time I really looked at it. The words were carefully constructed, almost clinical. accusations thin as smoke, designed to sow doubt. I read them over and over, trying to understand her mind, trying to dissect the intention behind every choice of phrase. And I realized it wasn't just revenge, it was fear. Her fear, thinly veiled under manipulation, her fear of losing control, of watching someone move on while she stayed trapped in a self-made narrative of power. I had become a symbol of freedom she couldn't grasp or admit she had ever lost. I closed the laptop, exhaling slowly. I felt the first flicker of something I hadn't felt in months: clarity. If this was a game to her, I didn't have to play. The next morning, I woke early. The sky was pale, streaked with soft gray clouds, and the city smelled faintly of wet asphalt and coffee. I put on my coat, grabbed my camera, and left without a plan. I just walked. Past the cafes, past the bookstores, past the streets where we had argued and laughed and fallen in love. Each step felt heavier and lighter at the same time, like moving through water that both pushed against and buoyed me. I ended up at the riverfront, the place where she and I had shared our last real conversation before everything turned brittle and cold. The bridge arched above the water, the lights reflecting in the ripples below like broken glass. I set the camera on the railing, framing the scene. And I smiled. Not a sarcastic, triumphant smile, not a bitter, defensive one. A real smile. The kind that grows from the knowledge that you've survived something that could have destroyed you. I took a picture. Then, without thinking, I sent it. Not to her, not to anyone, just to the cloud, the storage, as if to leave proof that I had existed in that space and that I had chosen myself. And then I walked away. It was Emily who came back into the narrative later that week. She had invited me to a small gallery opening. Nothing grand, just a modest event in a repurposed warehouse. The space smelled of paint and old wood, and the lights were warm, spilling in clusters above abstract sculptures and canvases covered in jagged streaks of color. We wandered through the exhibit, side by side, sometimes touching lightly, sometimes just letting the silence speak. She stopped at one painting, a swirl of blue and gold that seemed almost alive in the flickering light. "People come here to hide," she said, "behind colors, behind words, but the truth is always staring at them." I watched her face, illuminated by the soft glow. Her eyes held no judgment, no pressure, only an honesty I hadn't realized I had craved. "I think I'm done hiding," I said. She smiled, a small knowing smile. "Good, it's the hardest part." Later that night the text came again. "I see you, still in the same places, same tables, same streets. Are you happy?" I read it carefully, the words arranged in a way that demanded a reaction. But instead of typing, I set the phone down and looked out the window at the city lights. Happiness wasn't something she could measure or disrupt anymore. It had shifted inside me, imperceptible to her manipulations. Emily, sitting nearby on the couch, noticed. "Don't respond," she said gently. "She's fishing, and you're not the catch anymore." I nodded. That was exactly right. The next day, I went to the cafe again, the table near the window, the one that had witnessed everything: laughter, tears, arguments, goodbyes. This time I didn't take a photo. I just sat, watched people pass by. The barista, now a familiar face, brought me a cappuccino without asking. The warmth of the cup seeped through my fingers and grounded me. And then I saw him, the man from the selfie, sitting at a table near the entrance, talking loudly on his phone, glancing once or twice toward the window as if waiting for her. I didn't move. I didn't even flinch. I just watched. A part of me felt the old sting, the betrayal, the sharpness of memory, but it was faint, a distant echo. Because now I understood something essential. Their happiness wasn't mine to challenge, and my worth wasn't tied to her recognition. That night, Emily and I walked along the pier. The water shimmered with reflections of the city, waves lapping against the pilings in a steady rhythm. She didn't speak at first, letting the silence settle. Finally she said, "You're letting go." I looked at her, surprised. "I am?" She nodded. "Not because you're forgetting, not because it doesn't hurt anymore, but because you're choosing something better for yourself. That's the real victory." Her words struck a chord deep inside me. I realized she was right. For months I had imagined revenge, imagined scenes of confrontation, dramatic texts, the perfect moment of triumph. But real victory didn't feel like that. It felt like breathing again. Like letting the city in, letting people in, letting myself exist without the shadow of her control. A few days later, the texts stopped. Completely. I don't know if she finally understood that I wasn't playing the game, or if she had moved on to another attempt at manipulation elsewhere. I didn't care. I didn't check, didn't obsess. Instead, I focused on living. I met friends I had neglected, reconnected with old routines, spent weekends wandering the city with Emily. Each day, the pain faded a little more, replaced by something I hadn't realized I was capable of, quiet contentment. And then, one evening, she appeared again. Not in a text, not on social media, but at the gallery where Emily and I were hosting a small show for some local artists. She was standing near the entrance, alone, scanning the room. Our eyes met for a brief second, and for the first time, I saw something I hadn't expected. Regret. Or maybe it was acknowledgement. She didn't approach, she didn't speak. She just lingered for a moment before turning and walking away. Emily and I didn't speak about it until later, sitting on the rooftop of my apartment, the city stretching endlessly around us. The air was crisp, the neon lights glinting off the glass towers. "She's gone," Emily said. "I think so," I replied. "And that's okay." We sat in silence, not needing to fill the space. The weight of what had happened, the emotional games, the late-night anxieties, it all settled like dust, finally finding rest. And in that moment, I realized something essential. Life wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving someone wrong or showing them what they'd lost. It was about choosing yourself, again and again, even when it hurt, even when the memories lingered. A week later, I returned to the cafe one last time. I didn't take a photo, didn't think about sending anything. I just sat, sipping my cappuccino, watching the world move around me. Outside, the city hummed with its usual rhythm, a mix of voices, footsteps, and the distant wail of a siren. And for the first time in a long while, I smiled without irony, without nostalgia, without a shadow of her lingering over me, because I was free. And in the quiet, Emily reached for my hand. That simple touch, warm, grounding, unspoken, felt like a promise. Not of perfection, not of drama, not of fantasy, just reality, just connection. And in that, I found the redemptive peace I hadn't realized I'd been searching for. The weeks after the gallery night settled into a strange rhythm. The city moved around me, unchanging in its relentless hum, but I felt different. Lighter, yes, but also sharper, more aware of every subtle shift in the people and spaces I inhabited. Every reflection in the glass, every movement in the shadows, carried a story, a potential twist, and I was noticing them all. Emily had become a quiet anchor in the storm of my own thoughts. There was a sense of rhythm in her presence. She spoke little, but her words always landed where they needed to. I started to understand, fully, what it meant to be truly seen by someone, not like the way she had seen me once, in fleeting moments of shared laughter, but fully, without judgment, without expectation, without manipulation. But even as life seemed to settle into this fragile calm, a thread of unease lingered, faint, almost imperceptible, yet persistent. It started with the gallery. A small, anonymous donation appeared in my inbox. $500, with no message, no signature. At first I assumed it was routine, some local supporter of the arts perhaps. But then another donation appeared, smaller, with the same lack of explanation. And then another, always just enough to catch my attention, always leaving me wondering. Who was watching? Who knew? I tried not to let it bother me, but when the third donation arrived on a Sunday, the weight of it became impossible to ignore. Someone was paying attention, deliberately, tracking my movements, testing boundaries. And though I didn't say it aloud, I knew the culprit was her. I hadn't heard from her in weeks, no texts, no photos, no social media interactions. Yet somehow she remained present, invisible but omnipresent, a ghost weaving her influence through my life. Emily noticed my tension that night as we walked home along the rain-slick streets. "You're thinking about her," she said quietly. I stopped, looking down at the puddles reflecting the streetlights. "I can't explain it," I admitted. "It's subtle, but it feels like she's everywhere, even when she isn't." Emily's hand found mine. "People like that," she said. "They leave fingerprints on your life. You just have to stop looking for them. Stop letting the memory dictate your steps." I nodded, but I didn't fully believe her. The donations, the timing, the faint shadows at the edge of my awareness. It was like she had built an invisible scaffolding around my life, a structure meant to remind me that she still existed. The tension escalated subtly over the following days. I began noticing signs that weren't coincidental. A coffee cup left on my doorstep that didn't belong to anyone I knew had a folded note inside a library book I had borrowed months ago. Small, deliberate, unnerving reminders of her presence. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone else, a prankster, a fan of her drama. But I knew better. Every detail, every timing, every quiet observation screamed her name. And then came the texts. Not direct, not confrontational, just images. A shot of the cafe where we had shared so much, taken from across the street. A photo of the river at night, the same pier where I had sat thinking about freedom. A picture of Emily, candid, laughing with me in the gallery, sent with no explanation, no caption. The messages were precise, cold, calculated. She was testing me, reminding me that she could still reach inside my life and unsettle me. I didn't respond. I never responded. But inside, I felt the familiar ache of old wounds, the ghost of betrayal whispering in my chest. I began documenting everything. Every message, every anonymous donation, every subtle reminder of her presence. Not to use it, not to confront, but to understand, to regain control by seeing it for what it was. And in that act of observation, I realized something critical. I was no longer a victim. I was a participant in a narrative I could choose to rewrite. One evening, I found myself back at the pier, camera in hand, rain falling softly around me. Emily had insisted I take time for myself, to process, to find the center that had been shaken by weeks of quiet manipulation. I photographed the reflections in the water, the way the city lights fractured across the ripples, the movement of passing boats that left trails of orange and blue behind them. And then, unconsciously, I captured something else, a shadow moving along the walkway on the opposite bank. For a heartbeat, I thought it was her. The old fear surged, sharp and immediate, but the figure turned, and I realized it wasn't her at all, just a passerby, walking alone, oblivious to my presence. And yet, the reminder was enough. The ghost of her lingered in my imagination, persistent and unrelenting, a whisper at the edge of perception. I began to notice small patterns in my own life that I hadn't recognized before. Habits influenced by fear, choices made in response to old trauma, the subtle ways we allow someone's absence to govern our decisions. It was humbling, terrifying, and oddly liberating. Emily helped me see this. One night, as we shared a quiet meal at a small rooftop restaurant, the city stretching endlessly around us, she said, "The past only has power if you let it. You can live fully, but it requires acknowledgement, not confrontation." Her words resonated deeply, and I realized, slowly, that my quest for revenge, my lingering attention to her manipulations, had been less about her and more about reclaiming myself. It was around this time that the first real breakthrough happened. I received a final message from her. It wasn't angry, spiteful, or manipulative, just one photo, a blurred image of her standing alone on a street I recognized, the same street where we had walked together months ago, arguing, laughing, breaking apart. She looked smaller in the frame, almost fragile, and beneath the image, 3 words, "I'm sorry." I stared at it for what felt like hours. The city outside my window was alive with lights, noise, and movement, but inside, time seemed to stretch and fold around that simple admission. For the first time, I understood. She hadn't wanted to hurt me, at least not truly. She had wanted to assert control over her own life, to reclaim something she thought she'd lost. And in doing so, she had collided with my existence. And I realized something else, too. I didn't need her apology to move on. I needed it only to close the story in my mind, to acknowledge that the chapter had ended, even if imperfectly. The next morning, I went back to the cafe one last time. The city was waking slowly, early commuters moving through wet streets, the smell of fresh pastries mingling with coffee. I sat at our table, alone, the chair across from me empty. I didn't take a photo. I didn't send a message. I just sat and breathed, letting the quiet fill the space left by weeks of tension, manipulation, and memory. Emily joined me after a few minutes, bringing a croissant and a smile that warmed the cold morning air. She didn't speak about the past, didn't ask about the messages. She simply sat, offering presence instead of interrogation, and it was enough. For the first time in months, I felt whole. Later that evening, I found her again, not in person, not on my phone, not in the shadows. Just in memory, in reflection, in the quiet understanding that comes when a chapter truly closes. I realized that she would always be part of my story, just as I would always be part of hers. But the power she once held over me, the ability to unsettle, to provoke, to control, was gone, and in that absence of power, I discovered freedom. The days after that were quiet but full. I continued my work, deepened my connection with Emily, and allowed myself to experience joy without guilt. Sometimes, in fleeting moments, I would remember her, not with anger, not with pain, but with the clarity of understanding. It was bittersweet. It was human. And it was mine. The city had begun to feel different. Not the streets, not the lights, not the endless hum of cars and people moving through the spaces I inhabited. Those remained unchanged. What felt different was me. I walked with a lighter step, though my eyes remained vigilant. I laughed more freely, though the echoes of past betrayals lingered like faint, persistent shadows. And when I thought of her, it was no longer the sharp sting of anger or heartbreak, but a quiet acknowledgment that our paths had once intertwined, and that intersection had shaped me in ways I hadn't fully understood until now. Emily and I were growing closer, but not in the theatrical, cinematic way that movies promise. Our connection was quiet, real, and above all, grounded in trust. On one Friday evening, we wandered through a small art installation near the river, a maze of mirrors and soft projections. I watched her face as she moved, observing her reflection fracturing in the glass, and I realized how different this felt from every previous relationship I had endured. No manipulation, no subtle tests, just presence, just reality. Yet, despite this newfound serenity, there was a part of me that remained wary. Memories of her, not Emily, the other one, continued to flicker at the edges of my consciousness, insistent as a shadow I could not shake. It started subtly, the way old patterns often do. A glance at my phone that felt heavier than usual. A fleeting thought when Emily and I walked down familiar streets. Small signs in the city that seemed to whisper her name. I began noticing them in ways that were almost absurd. The way a coffee cup appeared on a ledge in the same position she might have left it. The way a man in a trench coat moved across the street with an almost deliberate cadence. The way reflections in store windows seemed to flicker just beyond the edge of my vision. It was unsettling. Not because she had returned, not because I feared confrontation, but because my own mind was now attuned to notice patterns that might not exist. Years of emotional investment had sharpened my perception, made me hyper-aware, and left me walking a fine line between caution and paranoia. Emily noticed this, of course. She always notices. One evening, as we sat on a rooftop watching the neon lights shimmer across wet asphalt, she spoke carefully, her voice soft yet firm. "You're looking for her," she said. "I'm not," I lied, though the words tasted hollow. "You are," she corrected gently. "You're searching for echoes in shadows, and you don't realize it, but it keeps you tethered." Her words pierced the quiet night. I sat back, watching the traffic below, recognizing the truth in her observation. She was right. I had spent months reacting, analyzing, cataloging every message, every small act, every memory. Even as I felt free, part of me was still entwined with the past. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. It was a Tuesday morning. The city was damp from overnight rain, the air heavy and fragrant with wet pavement and roasted coffee beans. I had a meeting scheduled at a small, modern co-working space downtown, but I arrived early and lingered outside, letting the city wake around me. The windows of nearby cafes reflected a fractured sunrise, and in one of those reflections, I saw her. Not physically, not across the street, not in person, but in the reflection, fleeting, blurred, as if she had been embedded into the glass itself. The moment lasted barely a second, yet it was enough to set my pulse racing, my chest tightening with a sudden surge of old emotion. I blinked. She was gone. For a moment, I considered calling Emily, sending a text, anything to ground myself. But then I realized the truth. The reflection wasn't her. It was me. A trick of light, a fracture of memory and expectation. My mind had grafted her onto the city, her image onto the patterns. I had trained myself to notice. And in that realization, I understood something crucial. The last threads that tethered me to her were not external. They had always been internal. Emily and I met later that day at the gallery. I arrived first, wandering among the paintings, letting my fingers trace the texture of canvas and paint. I could feel her presence behind me, calm and steady as always, and I let myself breathe. "You're quieter today," she said as she approached. "I've been thinking," I admitted. About her, about everything. Emily nodded, understanding more than she let on. You've been carrying her in your mind longer than you've carried yourself. That ends today. I laughed softly, a humorless sound at first, then something warmer. I don't think it's that simple. Nothing worth having ever is, she replied. Her words were comforting, grounding, and they reminded me of a truth I had nearly forgotten. Freedom, true freedom, wasn't granted by distance or silence. It was claimed through choice, by deciding finally to step forward without dragging the past in your wake. The subtle game she had played over the weeks, the anonymous donations, the images, the texts, had left me poised on the edge of catharsis. I had catalogued every message, every visual cue, every encounter, not to respond, but to understand. And now, as I sat at the gallery, watching patrons drift between canvases, I felt the first real sense of control, the recognition that her power over me had always been illusory. It wasn't hers to wield anymore. It had never been. Then it happened. A small envelope was slipped under the gallery door as Emily and I prepared to leave. I picked it up, noting the careful handwriting, familiar, deliberate, impossibly precise. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave it unopened, to let the gesture dissolve into irrelevance. But another part, the part that had spent weeks deciphering shadows, compelled me to see. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully. No words, no message, just a photograph. It was of the cafe, the table we had once shared, empty. But something about the framing, the light, the angle, the subtle reflection in the window made it unmistakably personal. And then, on the back, a small note. I see now. I stared at it, the simple phrase shaking something loose inside me. Not anger, not betrayal, just recognition. It was her acknowledgement that she had overstepped, that the game she had played had ended, that somehow, through silence, through reflection, through observation, I had reclaimed my life. Emily watched me study the photo. It's over, she said. Her voice was steady, warm, grounding. You don't need her anymore. I nodded, letting the weight of it settle. The tension, the vigilance, the quiet fear, all of it dissolved in that single acknowledgement. Freedom was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet. It was subtle. And it was mine. The next morning I returned to the pier. The water glimmered under the soft light of dawn, ripples dancing like fragments of memory across the surface. Emily joined me, her hand finding mine naturally. We walked without speaking, the sound of water lapping against the pilings, and the distant hum of traffic filling the silence. We stopped at the end of the pier, looking out over the city. It was peaceful, not perfect, not untouched by pain or memory, but serene in a way that felt earned. I never thought I'd feel this, I admitted quietly. Emily squeezed my hand. It's not about forgetting, it's about choosing. And you chose well. I smiled, the first time in months that the smile felt unguarded, uncalculated. The final twist, the resolution I had longed for without realizing it, came subtly. A week later I saw her one last time, truly in person, across a small street, hurrying past, her expression unreadable. She glanced at me, and in that brief exchange there was no malice, no manipulation, only recognition. I smiled. She hesitated, just for a heartbeat, and then walked on. It was the final act, not dramatic, not cinematic, not designed to wound or provoke, just human, just real. And in that moment I understood completely. The story we had shared was over, but it had shaped me, taught me, hardened and softened me in equal measure. And now, the chapters that remained were mine to write, with Emily by my side, grounded in reality, honesty, and choice. I returned to the cafe one last time alone. I didn't photograph, didn't text, didn't linger in memory. I simply sat, sipping my coffee, watching the city move around me. The weight of the past had lifted, leaving space for something new, something fragile, something worth nurturing. Emily joined me a few minutes later. We talked about mundane things, the weather, small plans, the gallery, nothing dramatic, nothing heavy. The conversation flowed naturally, effortlessly, a quiet testament to the life we were building together. I realized then that happiness was not a grand gesture. It was small, cumulative, layered in moments of presence, of recognition, of choice. And for the first time in years, I felt it fully, without apology, without pretense. The city lights flickered through the window as evening settled. The streets outside carried the usual sounds of life, traffic, voices, music, distant sirens. But none of it reached me in the way it had before. I was present, grounded, free. and in the quiet, redemptive hum of life continuing, I understood this. Sometimes the most dramatic victories are the ones that leave no trace at all, except the faint echo of a life reclaimed, a heart healed, and the quiet promise of the future. The weeks that followed felt like a slow exhale. The city continued its relentless rhythm. Car horns, footsteps, laughter drifting through alleys, but inside me there was a calm that I hadn't known I could carry. I returned to my routines, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. The gallery, the cafe, the riverfront pier, these spaces had once been haunted by memory and tension, yet now they felt like stages for a life I had consciously reclaimed. Emily and I walked more often, sometimes in silence, sometimes with quiet conversation that needed no drama to hold meaning. The light would shift across the streets as the day waned, casting long shadows that felt less like threats and more like reminders of the past, shaping the present without controlling it. I began noticing the small joys again, the texture of sunlight against wet pavement, the smell of fresh coffee beans in the morning, the laughter of strangers echoing across a plaza. Life had regained its subtle poetry. One evening, I found myself back at the cafe alone, the place where everything had begun, where betrayal had first carved its mark, and where my subtle reclamation of power had started. I took the same table near the window, watching the reflections of lights ripple across the glass. Outside, the streets shimmered wet from the afternoon rain. I could feel the familiar tension, that faint pull of memory, but this time it did not linger long. It was there, a whisper, and then it was gone. I remembered the selfie she had sent, the word upgraded, etched in its cruel simplicity. I remembered the sting, the ache, the temptation to respond with anger. And I remembered my choice, to respond not with venom, but with authenticity, with presence, with life. That choice had been more powerful than any confrontation, more liberating than any victory imagined in anger. Emily arrived shortly after, sliding into the seat across from me with the quiet grace that had become her signature. She brought a croissant and a small smile, the kind that didn't demand anything, just offered companionship. We sat together for a while, sharing silence, watching life move around us. "You're different," she said finally, her eyes catching the reflection of streetlights in the glass. "The tension, the edge, it's gone." I nodded. "I finally stopped reacting," I admitted. "Not because I forgot, not because it didn't hurt, but because I stopped giving her the power to dictate how I felt." She reached across and took my hand. Her touch was grounding, affirming, an anchor in a world that had once felt full of manipulation and ghosts. "And that's real freedom," she said softly. Later, walking along the pier as the sun set, casting gold across rippling water, but I felt a lightness I hadn't known I could carry. The past still existed, but it was behind me now, acknowledged, understood, but no longer threatening. Each step felt deliberate, unhurried, meaningful. Emily walked beside me, her presence a quiet testament to the life I had chosen over resentment, over obsession, over the lingering shadow of what once was. And in that choice, I found the final lesson. True victory is not about proving someone wrong, exacting revenge, or even receiving acknowledgement from those who once hurt you. It is about reclaiming yourself, your time, your emotional landscape. It is about creating space where joy, love, and presence can flourish, unimpeded by ghosts of the past. Weeks turned into months. The city, with all its lights and noise, became a canvas on which I painted a life rebuilt. I kept some rituals, small reminders of what had been and how far I had come. The pier, the gallery, the cafe, these were not anchors of memory, but markers of growth. Emily and I explored new neighborhoods, laughed over meals in cramped kitchens, wandered streets at dawn, discovering the quiet magic that exists in ordinary moments when you are fully present. Sometimes late at night, I would glance at my phone, half expecting a message from her, the echo of that old manipulation. But it never came, and I didn't seek it, because I knew now that my story was mine, and the chapters written by her were only part of the narrative, not the whole. One evening Emily and I sat on my apartment balcony, the city a web of lights below us, the distant hum of life stretching endlessly into the night. We didn't speak for a long time. We didn't need to. Silence had become our language, full of understanding, trust, and shared presence. Finally, she leaned against my shoulder. "You're happy," she said. I smiled, the kind of smile that is quiet, enduring, and full of recognition for what had been endured and overcome. I am, I admitted. Not perfect, not without scars, but free, and that's enough. Emily squeezed my hand gently. It's more than enough. I realized then that the story of heartbreak, betrayal, and subtle revenge had a purpose far beyond any drama. It had forced me to confront who I was, who I wanted to become, and what real strength looked like. That strength was quiet, invisible, and often overlooked, but it was enduring. It was presence. It was the courage to step forward, even when the past whispers in your ear, even when shadows linger, even when the world seems poised to replay old wounds. And in that moment, I understood fully that I had not just survived, I had transcended. Have you ever allowed the actions of someone from your past to dictate your present? How often do we give others power over our emotions, consciously or unconsciously? When confronted with betrayal or heartbreak, is the desire for revenge worth the cost, or is the true victory found in reclaiming yourself, your choices, and your peace? How do we distinguish between closure that comes from external acknowledgement and the freedom that emerges from within? And finally, in a world full of shadows and ghosts, what does it truly mean to choose your own life, fully and without apology?